yeah, when we look at the history of Indian writing in English chronologically, there is this period 1950s and 1960s, and whichever literary history that you take a look at, we do not find anyone labeling that period 1950s and 1960s. It is usually just called by the years that they signify, 1950s and 1960s, because until the 1940s there is a way in which nationalist movement is being invoked, and by 1970s again it is seen as the decade which sort of the almost silent decade before the major second coming of Indian writing in English happens in 1980s. Yeah. So, about 1950s and 1960s, there are a lot of these ways in which generally the decades have been talked about. Yeah. So, we will quickly take a look at some of the major writers who are being talked about in 1950s and 60s, and it is also difficult to club them together in under any particular theme. Yeah. And here we also need to keep in mind Waiting for the Mahatma. It is also published in 1955, 1950s, yeah, but it does not, that is not a text which is discussed along with this discussion of the writers of the 1950s and 1960s. The discussions on Waiting for the Mahatma happens in continuation with the 1930s, 1940s discussion. So, there is a very convenient kind of slotting of these writers and these novels that we begin to see. Yeah. And coming to the novelists of the 1950s and 60s, there is an entire chapter devoted in Mehrotra's literary history, which I also asked you to take a look at. There is a limited preview in Google Books. I think only 2 pages are missing in that. Yeah. So, it is written by Shyamalan Narayan and John Mee, sort of a review of the 2 decades, 1950s and 60s. They are also like leading critics and writers of in Indian novel in English. Yeah. So, this in this survey kind of an essay, they begin by talking about again invoking the linguistic difficulties which were prevalent, and also how it was seen as unpatriotic when one chooses to write in English, and also refers to the Narayan's novel which won the Sahitya Academy Award, also indicating the kind of acceptance that English or writing in English was gaining in the institutional academic circles. Yeah. And it also then talks about the dominant concern of the literature of this period, the 1950s and 60s, though it is difficult to club all the writers of this period under one rubric. Here they begin talking about the dominant concern being the character development, psychological depth, about the sense of the alienated individual who is dissatisfied with modern life. Yeah. So, those are some of the modern concerns which they talk about, and there are also certain works which talk about some of the events of national importance, but again narrowing down to the domestic familial circles. There are a lot of women writers who come up during this time as well, and this period is also seen as the period in which the women writers begin to gain more visibility, and in this essay Narayan and Mee, they talk about how these set of writers, they do not form any particular school, but their emergence is a striking period, because the women writers also cannot be clubbed together under the same set of discussion. And some of the important writers they begin to mention: Kamala Markandeya, Ruth Braver Jhabwala, Nayanthara Sehgal, Anita Desai, and these are also the writers who also enjoyed international readership. Yeah? So, their reputation was not limited to the to this country alone. And then he introduces us to a set of male writers who have also enjoyed a significant reputation within India and abroad. He begins by talking about Khushwant Singh. Have you read any of the works by Khushwant Singh?
Train to Pakistan.
Yeah, Train to Pakistan. Yeah. And he's also been seen as a very controversial writer, and there's again, when it comes to Khushwant Singh, he's not really seen among one of the leading Indian English novelists. Yeah? There's a very different way in which he is incorporated into the discussion, like Naipaul. Yeah? And because maybe the frameworks within which he writes, critiques, they're also a little uncomfortable to be situated within the conventional critical framework. And he's also someone who began to very openly talk about man-woman relationships, about aspects related to sex. Yeah, so many of the things which were considered taboo within not just within Indian writing in English, but within the cultural scheme of things itself. He begins to talk about those things. He's continued to enjoy a controversial reputation as well. Then there is Ruskin Bond, yeah, who his career is also it spans like almost 3 to 4 decades, yeah, and he was mostly a master storyteller, yeah, and again we find that if you look at the critical body of writings about Ruskin Bond, he's also been appropriated into this children's literature, yeah, that sort of writing mostly, yeah, and also about the enduring way in which he tells stories about the certain local realities which are within India, and we do not find any kind of a definite attention being given to the writers of the 50s and 60s compared to Rajarao Narayan and Mulk Raj, yeah, who were writing in the previous decade, yeah, and it's also like in Ruskin Bonds, again there's this attention to the provincial towns, the life of the non-urban India. So those are the things which are being highlighted mostly. Then there is Arun Joshi. How many of you have read any of the novels by Arun Joshi? Okay, yeah. Yeah, that was seen as a very different kind of novel, and it also won the Sahitya Academy Award. But after this, in fact, Arun Joshi's novels could not really get the kind of the attention that it deserved. That also many feel, because soon after that Rushdie happens, and then there is no critical space available at all to look at any of the other kinds of writings other than the nation dominated narratives, yeah. So again Arun Joshi's works, he also talks about the tribal community, a different kind of in India, but the difference that he seems to sort of foreground, yeah, that's not really been taken up in the critical space as much as many would have liked to. So in case anyway, we will not talk much about Joshi because we will be having an entire presentation and a discussion on that. And then there are also a number of women writers who began to emerge during this period. Can you begin to name some of them? I did the same thing in the beginning of the class, just repeat. Kamala Markandeya, Anita Desai, yeah, Ruth Praval Chapwala. I'm always grateful to the ones who are presenting on Chapwala, because that's the only way in which we all get to hear about Chapwala. How many of you have read her otherwise? Yeah. She's and also we could have included Atia Hussain. Yeah, heard about her? Atia Hussain's the well-known work is Sunlight on a Broken Column, a 1960s novel. Again, that's also a very different kind of a novel, like Chapwala's Heat and Dust, but very compared to the critical attention that the others have received, she also has not received much attention. Usually, when we talk about women writers, it's about Nayanthara Sehgal, it's about Anita Desai, Kamala Markandeya. There is a set of writers whom we always fall back on. And what were the dominant themes? If you have read one or two, you would be able to say what are the dominant themes that they talk about. Anita Desai, Kamala Markandeya. Have you read any Anita Desai?
The one novel that I'm sending on, Try the Peacock, talks about relationships, alienation, which is the central themes.
Yeah.
With the female as a protagonist.
Yeah. So in the 1950s and 1960s, when we talk about women writers writing in English, we realize there are women writing in English, there are female protagonists, but suddenly the focus shifts from the outside to the inside. It's a domestic space which is getting foregrounded. It's about home, it's about relationships, it's about a family. It's about how the tradition modernity tussle is getting enacted within these private spheres. Yeah? And some of the novels are also autobiographical in nature. Yeah? So suddenly we find we are not really talking about the novels per se, but the way the critical tradition has been talking about these set of novels, suddenly in the 1950s and 60s, it's as if, you know, these women who've been entrusted with the task of taking care of the domestic space. Yeah, men will take care of the nation, men will address the larger issues which are connected with politics, about, you know, nationalism, about the post-coloniality which is, you know, which the nation is also experiencing. Yeah, but the women on the other hand will also talk about how this is getting enacted within these private domestic spaces by telling their own stories. Yeah, so it's not as if, you know, women telling their own stories was a big deal. I mean, across cultures, if you see in the Western tradition, there was a point of time, you know, from the 17th, 18th centuries onwards, women started writing their own stories, talking about themselves, talking about the domestic affairs, how, you know, about relationships, how, you know, this there's a constant tussle between the private and the public. But when it comes to India, it was certainly big deal, yeah, because otherwise there was no tradition of women telling their own stories. Women's lives were to be kept private. There was no public telling, public articulation of their experiences and their stories. So, in that sense, it did make a marked difference in the way women were beginning to write about their own stories, about their own experiences. Not that they were all radical enough, yeah, in any way, but nevertheless, that was a big moment to be reckoned with. But at the same time, you know, before I continue, I also want you to also want to draw your attention to the conclusion of this essay before we go any further. Did you take a look at that last paragraph which I asked you to read? What does it say? It says the 1950s and 1960s were not a period of great innovation for Indian writing in English, although they witnessed the foundation of writing careers that have lasted over several decades, and which, especially for women writers, brought international acclaim. Yeah. Many of the novels seem highly skeptical of the dominant forms of Indian culture and society, choosing to find a more authentic idea of India in the landscape, the provincial town or traditional village life. Yeah. And towards the end again, the women writers whose Emergence provide this period with one of its few distinctive features phrase the conflict in relation to the condition of women. But emancipation in their novels is often figured in terms of personal release into what seems a very literary realm of transcendence. And the final paragraph, a very short paragraph of just 2 sentences, it talks about how these novels also, they began to acquire a very dominant command over the novel writing itself, that they began to achieve, you know, a sort of a command over the genre itself. Yeah. So, this is how Shyamalan Narayan and John Mee end their essay, and in between they talk about these women writers. So, I want you to you know, listen to this, keeping in mind that this is the conclusion that they have also reached, that though there are women writers emerging, this was not a significant period because there was no major innovation happening. So, why is this sort of a presentation being made about the women writers? Yeah, though there is a way in which their emergence is celebrated, but at the same time they are not being given much of a significance apart from, you know, the limited ways in which they engage with themselves, about women lives. Yeah, how about the political resonance which was also inherent in these works in certain different ways? Or do these critics and many others who followed suit, have they chosen the convenient critical route of not paying attention to the politics which operates outside, you know, the nationalist, yeah, post-colonial frameworks? How about the politics of gender? Yeah, we find very limited scholarly attention being paid to these women writers, apart from the fact that, you know, they enjoyed some visibility in the international scenario, and also, you know, to a great extent we can also say that even these women were part of the nationalist project. In that sense, you know, it's not as if they were constructing women characters who were entirely an antithesis to the nationalist construction of womanhood, but nevertheless we find that there is an inability to perhaps include certain writers, such as, you know, the work that we would listen about in the next class, Heat and Dust by Ruth Pravar Chhabwala, or an Atiya Hussain. Yeah, there is an inability to include them as part of the major critical discussion. Yeah, they are only being mentioned as you know, certain different kinds of articulation. Yeah, they are not being seen as a center like certain writers mostly like male writers were seen as the center in each decade. So, since we do not find any major male writers emerging in the 1950s and 60s, yeah. So, one cannot be entirely wrong in assuming, in wondering whether that is also a reason for not giving enough merit, enough recognition to these two decades, 1950s and 1960s. Because later also when we look at the kind of works which begin to come out in the 1990s, there are a lot of anthologies of women writers who begin to come out. There also we get the sense that women began to enjoy a certain kind of a visibility from the 1950s and 1960s onwards, but it is not seen as a major phase, yeah. And later even the post 1980s, yeah, again we find that the role, the recognition which is given to the women writers, it is very limited. It's almost like a side dish. There are these major male writers dealing with very important aspects of the nation, and there are also these number of writers, yeah. So we'll quickly take a look at how Nayanthara Sehgal, Kamala Markandeya and Anita Desai have been presented. And Nayanthara Sehgal, in fact, who's Nayanthara Sehgal? Of course, she's a writer.
Nehru's niece.
Who's her mother? Huh? Whose niece?
Nehru's Jawaharlal.
Yes, yeah. So, who's her mother?
Vijayalakshmi.
Yeah, right. Yeah, she's Vijayalakshmi Pandit's daughter and Nehru's niece. Yeah. But what makes her very distinctive is that we do not find her like towing the line and doing exactly replicating a celebration of the nationalist story. She in fact one of her novels, it talks about a critique of the emergency period, yeah, a novel which was published in the 1980s, yeah. And even that's also not a very well discussed novel, but it's also one of the important emergency novels written from this Indian writing in English, yeah. And this novel is called Rich Like Us. It also had won an Academy Award, Sahityaka Academy Award, yeah. Rich Like Us is even today seen as one of the very important intervention in terms of the emergency novels which were written, okay. And Kamala Markandeya's works, Handful of Rice, The Golden Honeycomb, and the most important one, Nectar in a Sieve, yeah. So, there are these women who are also victims in most of her novels, and that has been worked and reworked in the Indian critical tradition. And these are also Kamala Markandeya, Anita Desai, these are also writers on whom a lot of work has been done, but within a similar kind of a framework. Yes. Yes.
The thing is that maybe these women are not become in the mainstream nationalist movement because they were told, like is what I read, they were told not now, later.
Huh.
So the thing is, maybe these women recognize that what happens at home in the domestic space is a reflection of what happens in the public space.
Yes, yes.
So that consciousness not rise at that time, and did they not receive the kind of recognition that they should?
Yeah,
because we're not talking directly about the home as being a projection of the nationalist,
yeah,
right? But it can be interpreted as that.
Yeah, in fact, Gandhi, Tagore and Aurobindo, most of the leading nationalist figures also believe that whatever happens in home is going to be a reflection of what happens at the nation front, yeah, which is why I don't know if you're familiar with this essay by Partha Chatterjee, The Nationalist Resolution of the Women's Question, yeah. That was also, if you look at the nationalist concerns by the major reform leaders, yeah, the gender question, yeah, more than the gender question, the question of women, yeah, the uplift of women, yeah, the rescue of women, that was always there. Either it is the anti-sati rhetoric or about widow remarriage, yeah, or whatever it is, like making them part of the nation building after the moment of independence, yeah. So there is nationalist concern was always there about the women's question, yeah. Partha Chatterjee talks about how this it was also about resolving the gender question in such a way that there is a very definite this separation and dichotomy of the public and the private. There are certain realms which women need to take care of, yeah. We are building the nation, yeah, save the families, yeah, because we should be able to even save the traditional values, because women are also seen as the seat of culture. They are the ones who are supposed to preserve the purity of whatsoever, yeah, the traditions, the value system, everything. So just as the reformers, the nationalist leaders are preserving the nation politically from being usurped by a foreign power, in the same way the families also had a responsibility to preserve all the traditional pristine aspects of Indian culture, quote unquote. Yeah. So, in that way, you know, there are some of them who also feel that maybe these women were also in a certain way participating in that project, yeah, knowingly or maybe inadvertently, yeah, by talking about certain female characters. Of course, you know, they are not saying women have to be repressed and they should remain, you know, traditional throughout, but they are talking that the way in which they begin to talk about the female characters also give us the impression that yes, you can have a certain kind of an articulation, a certain kind of a freedom, but also confined to certain limits, right. So, this is again, you know, the same sort of a thing that many of the nationalist leaders also endorsed, yeah. And again, when we are talking about them, we are necessarily not talking about the personalities of these women. We are talking about the kind of novels that they were writing, the kind of figures that the female figures, the female characters which were being presented through these novels, yeah. And coming to Anita Desai, yeah, her most famous work would be, you know, Bye Bye Blackbird, yeah, and she has also had a very successful long career, and in her work we find westernized educated women emerging, yeah. But the thing is that when we begin to talk about either Kamala Markandeya or Anita Desai, there is a the novels are inward looking, the criticism is also very inward looking, and one also begins to wonder whether there is again a certain exotic way through which the novel is presenting a certain kind of India to a Western audience, yeah, to a predominantly Western audience, yeah, because even the 1960s, 1970s, there is again, we see a heightened sense of language debates and all of those things happening, and one is not too sure of the solid readership that these writers enjoyed within the country, yeah. And if you compare the feminist writings which were emerging from the other parts of India, yeah, so we do not find the in Indian women writers in English being able to replicate those sort of things, yeah. So, coming back to this essay, now we come to Ruth Pravar Chhabwala, and about her, you know, even her identity is very contested, whether she is Indian or not, yeah. There are a lot of, you know, papers also you would find about the contested identities, but the same sort of arguments we find are not being used against many of the male writers who rose to fame after the 1980s, starting from Rushdie onwards, yeah. The identity becomes a contested notion mostly when it is a female writer, yeah, and otherwise, you know, most of those things are even they are glossed over, they are pretty much shoved under the carpet. And there is this observation about Ruth Pravar Chhabwala that she should not be considered an Indian writer, but as one of those European writers who have written about India, yeah. So, these are also some of the things perhaps Rani will talk about when we talk about the work. So, coming again, you know, so this essay, in fact, you know, apart from the survey sort of an approach that it takes in documenting the writers of 1960s and 1950s and 1960s, this essay by Shyamalan Narayan and John Mee, it does not make any major telling argument, except for the fact that towards the end they say this was not a major period of experimentation as far as Indian writing in English countries, but we did see the emergence of a few women writers, yeah. So, talking about the presence of women writers in general in Indian literature, we are not just talking about Indian writing in English, even otherwise. Can you name this seminal work which was published in the 1990s, yeah, which was, you know, a huge volume of an anthology of women writers from 600 BC onwards? Heard of, you know, this voluminous 2-volume work, Women Writing in India, edited by Susi Taru and K. Lalita. That was a major intervention, yeah. This was published in 1990-91. In fact, you know, it had dug up a number of forgotten writers, neglected writers, women writers from 600 BC onwards. It's an interesting work that you can take a look at as well. So, there also she points her attention to the minimal visibility of women writers throughout history, throughout India's literary history. Earlier, you know, maybe during the nationalist phase, if you could think about who are the nationalist women writers during that phase. Sarojini Naidu, yeah, and then Toru Dutt, yeah, just occasional names, and other than that we do not find much of a visibility being accorded to women, yeah. And it is only in the 1950s and 1960s, that is something, you know, that we need to give recognition to these writers who started writing in English. It's only in the 1950s and 1960s that we begin to see that women writers begin to get any real kind of a recognition and reputation, even in the regional literary histories. If you take a, you know, list of all of those early novels, yeah, and it's mostly a set of male writers that we are being introduced to, yeah. There may be female protagonists, but we do not have many female authors to talk about, yeah. There are a couple of, you know, early Malayalam novels which came out, which are being attributed to female authors, but again they were not really Indian authors. They were mostly, you know, wives of missionaries who were residing in India, and they had also learned the language and written, yeah. So that's a different case altogether. So it's from the 1950s and 60s that we begin to notice, yeah, any kind of visibility being accorded to women writers in the Indian writing scenario, not just in English but generally in the Indian writing scenario. And these writers, particularly the same ones that we spoke about, they are the ones who are repeatedly being mentioned. Nayanthara Sehgal, Anita Desai, Sasi Deshpande, their novels were also seen as being very autobiographical in nature, because they drew extensively from their personal experiences, yeah. There were ways in which, you know, there are the nation also played a role in terms of say the events, the backdrop, etc. Otherwise the stories were always drawn from the personal experiences. And we also find that these women also challenges certain conventions in terms of, you know, bringing out at least partially strong feminist characters. They also talk about daily lives, about personal conflicts. Here we find that family and home, the moment women writers begin to gain certain visibility, family, home, domestic relations, they all begin to assume a central role, yeah. And so it's a very different set of things that we talk about when we talk about women writers, and also about, you know, way in which family gets highlighted in multiple ways we see in most of these novels. And this is again, you know, a very telling nationalist rhetoric as well, about, you know, the family being the stronghold and the need to preserve the family against the onslaught of the Western traditions. But it's only at a later point of time that, with the intervention of the feminist movements, with the intervention of the feminist critiques, they begin to point out that family can also be a space where one can experience an utter loss of individual freedom, yeah. It may not be always the source of strength, yeah. It could also be the it could also be a stifling space which does not allow many kinds of personal and political articulations, yeah. So when we talk about these women writers, and time and again, you know, when we are forced to talk about only of the domestic sphere, only of the family, only of the private, only about the home, how does it politically resonate? Is there a politics in this or not? Or do you think these women writers also steered clear away from actively engaging with any sort of, from actively taking any political position or engaging with any sort of political position? So when we begin listening to some of these women writers, I also want you to think about these questions, as in when you familiarize yourself with the novel, the background that the novel talks about, etc. Yeah. And there are certain things that some of the post-colonial critics, I've heard of Harish Trivedi, yeah, he talks about the women writers of the 1950s and 1960s in a very different way. He says maybe the gender consciousness and the interest towards gender or the presentation of the female characters, all of those things were easily diverted in the interest of the nation state and its social imaginary. Yeah, because nation state, the social imaginary, the need to preserve all of those you know, as strongholds, because we are still a young nation when we think about the 1950s and 1960s. Yeah, so the major interests of the nation are diverted towards this. Yeah. So only a very partial sort of a very marginal kind of an attention is being given to issues of gender consciousness, yeah, and about the interests of women, and also about how women themselves begin to feel that they have to you know, present themselves and also present characters who could be appropriated, very well appropriated by the nationalist patriarchal ideology. Yeah, maybe it's also like reading too much into those, but again when we see the way in which all of these women who did not even emerge as part of one central school of women writing in English, we find they all repeatedly talk only about their private lives, only about home, only about the domestic affairs, and there is a complete refusal to deal with the outside. Yeah, the outside is important, but only in the ways in which it informs the functionings of the inside. Yeah, and about one of the examples that Harish Trivedi talks about is Kamala Markandeya's female characters. How in her novel, even when we come across a number of female characters, which is again a good thing to begin with, but the country as a whole in India is projected as an exotic land, as a land of romance, as a land of mystery. Yeah, so again there is this Western Eurocentric reader who is imagined by the author, and also about the emphasis on the exotic romantic values of duty, devotion, sacrifice, sublime love. All of these things are being seen as very feminine emotions and also part of an extension of the Indian culture, Indian tradition. How this is the way Indian culture can be sort of commodified in the space of fiction and exotically shown to the rest of the world. Also they begin to wonder, this is again Harish Trivedi talking, he begins to wonder whether there is again a stereotypical projection of women which we begin to see in these novels. Yeah, though in the conventional criticism they have also been celebrated as being giving a lot of space to female characters, and because in most of these novels we do not have the time to go through them, maybe when during the presentations we will again dwell upon those things, how these female characters, their intense sacrificial potential, these are the things which are being highlighted in most of the novels, especially in Shashi Deshpande's Kamala Markandeya, Anita Desai. Yeah, he also makes this comment, maybe these women, they are serving the twin purpose of fulfilling a commitment as well as ensuring the saleability of their books. Yeah, the commitment towards the nation, and also ensuring that the books sell. Yeah, the commitment towards the nation in the sense of participating in this nation building activity by maybe inadvertently dwelling upon the nationalist approach towards the gender question, and at the same time ensuring that the novels sell well, in the sense that the Indian writers writing in English until the 1980s, they were not really sure about the domestic market. Yeah, who is going to publish these novels which are being written in English and who are the readers. There weren't too many distributors who were willing to take them up. Yeah, so one always had to write for the Western audience. That was the inevitability of the market condition. We also find that the ones who were not writing for the market, the ones who were not getting their novels published abroad, they were not getting that kind of visibility either. In fact, even recently in one of his interviews, Alan Seeley talks about how maybe he made this terrible decision about not having chosen his publishers wisely. Yeah, because the canonical position, the visibility of your novel is also dependent on the ways in which it is positioned in the market. It's also about projecting. This is a view shared by Harish Trivedi and Susi Tharu. This is also about a way in which women are also equipped as not just like people who are equipped with the liberatory potential, but as people who can issue dire warnings against those who reject or break the sacrosanct traditional idea of woman. Yeah, Susi Tharu talks about this not in the context of Indian writing in English. She talks about this in her introduction to women writing India. She says it becomes all the more dangerous when women themselves they take it upon themselves to sort of execute this patriarchal ideology, and they think that as strong women, they should ensure that the family is preserved as a sacrosanct space, that tradition is preserved. Yeah, so at some level Harish Trivedi is also telling us that maybe these women, the women characters who were portrayed in the these writers such as mostly Kamala Markandeya, Shashi Deshpande and Anita Desai, yeah, maybe they were also unconsciously creating female characters who would uphold this tradition and also present an exotic image to the West. Yeah, because in terms of the readership, it's again very limited readership that they enjoyed within the home front as compared to the readership abroad. And Priyamvada Gopal, when she talks about the women writers of this period. In fact, there is an entire chapter. The way she positions them is very interesting. Srimada Gopal's work, the subtitle of this work titled The Indian English Novel is Nation, History and Narration. Yeah? And when she talks about the women writers, there is an entire chapter to them devoted to the women writers, and we cannot find the nation figuring in this work at all, though the subtitle is Nation, History and Narration. Yeah? So, the chapter in which she talks about the women writers, the title is Family Matters, Domesticity and Gender in the Novel. Yeah? So, it is always about certain things which happen in the private realms. Yeah? And here she also makes this very powerful observation about most of these female authors. They also are positioned in a way that the author functions as a native informant. Yeah, she is using that Orientalist rhetoric for that. Yeah, these authors, these women writers, they position themselves as a native informant for the assumed European or the American reader. Yeah, so they fail to rise beyond those sort of an expectations, and we find this sort of pattern being at least being broken when it comes to Arundhati Roy and her fiction. That is again post 90s, but when again it comes to the 1950s and 60s, it is not as if those kind of fiction were not getting written, because Atiya Hussein's work and her Heat and Dust that we will be listening to in the next session, those are examples that these patterns were also being broken, these patterns were also being challenged, yeah, but they were not part of the critical tradition in a very central way. And there is also a minor way in which some of these writers, yeah, they continue to narrate the same sort of stories by using the characters, the minority characters, yeah, because even in the post 1980s, whenever the inside story, the private stories are being narrated, it is mostly either the Parsi story, there is a Parsi family, there is a Muslim family. Yeah. So, it is as if if the private stories have to be told, yeah, they have to be told in such a way that it also has some kind of an exotic value abroad. It is not in the way in which the regional writers engage with the private realm, yeah, not in the radical way in which the regional writers engage with the private realm. So, maybe in the next class when Rani tells us about Heat and Dust, yeah, we will also discuss this further about how the politics operate in that, and what is so essentially problematic about Indian writing in English, that unless we talk about the nation, we do not seem to be talking about important things. Yeah, the feminist concerns are very limited. There are feminist concerns, but it fails to engage with the larger feminist politics that is in place. Again 1950s, 60s, 70s, those are also the decades which saw the rise of a number of women's movements from across the world, and these women writers, they also had a lot of international exposure. It is not as if they did not know what was happening in the within the feminist domain of feminist politics, but still there is a refusal to engage with it. I am not saying that they should necessarily engage with the Western packaged form of feminism, but even then, yeah, we do not find much of an engagement with with gender as a political category. Yeah. And if we talk about other kinds of absences, about caste, yeah, about only a certain kind of women getting represented, those are again things that we can perhaps come back to discuss at a later point. Shall we wrap up?